Howdy, Bhargav. Look, I just want to have a quick chat today, maybe interesting for some of our clients and maybe even for social media platforms to discuss the relevance of military in politics and indeed in power in the various regions we cover. I think we'll confine it today perhaps just to Asia Pacific, Europe, Middle East, Africa adds a whole another dimension. But I guess if we look in just taking three examples in Asia Pacific, it's actually quite rare in the Asia Pacific region, perhaps with the exception of Singapore, Australia and New Zealand, that the military doesn't play a key role in power. Obviously, you've got the notable case in Thailand where the military is always involved in politics, and indeed what has nurtured Thailand to be one of the most popular destinations in the world is also what it's often criticised for by the West, which obviously has its own views and often from a very insular, narrow-minded set where they think all countries should be like themselves. If we look at some of the historical, political, from civil powers in Thailand, it's been wrought with greedy narcissism, and the military's often come in to right the ship, and I'm not for 1 minute stating that they're clean, but it's all relative. And they're often judged by people that don't understand the downside of corrupt political parties, even though in the West, particularly in Australia and America, they all pretend that they've got a wonderful political system. The reality is they've got career politicians that act for various stakeholders and act for their own best interests and really don't do much for the long-term future of the country, although they portray that they are, and they manipulate the media to manipulate the people to think that they're all over it and operating in their best interests. In Malaysia, the military takes very much a back seat. Like in India, it's real issues at the top are very much masked, though everyone knows what those issues are. If we then contrast Thailand, say, with Myanmar, then you've got a military government in control that probably is in line with the weaknesses the Westerners identified. They mistakenly try to act their temple of know-allness over Thailand, but that template does actually probably fit the problems that Myanmar's experienced over the last 5 decades, more so over the last sort of 14 or 15 months. I guess it'd be interesting, Bhargav, to hear, in light of Imran Khan's disposal, about the military in Pakistan.
Well, it is quite interesting in Pakistan. It feels like history is repeating itself. No prime minister in the history of independent Pakistan since 1947 has ever completed a full term. This is partly because of the military intervention and partly not because of the military intervention. In this particular case, Imran Khan, I think he missed his own trick of being in power, that is, keep the army and the generals happy. Okay, the moment you cross over to their turf, they will make sure you actually count your costs. And that seems to be the case here, because every time Imran Khan took a step towards the wrong direction, it was General Bajwa who was doing the troubleshooting, who was managing the show. The best case in point I can give you is Imran Khan's belligerent statements about US and their intervention and role in Pakistani domestic politics, while General Bajwa stepped in and basically said our partnership with the global power, who has actually been in the region for over 2 decades, is a very critical one. And that kind of troubleshooting is the kind of stability the army brings into Pakistan in their political reality. It is all well and good to talk about the benevolence of democracy. Okay, it sounds great that people elect their rulers and human rights are protected under civilian government, but that is far from the political realities of states such as Pakistan, because we need to understand democratic evolutionary process is a convoluted one, and that is a direct reflection of the political evolution which has taken place over the last century, not just a few decades. Okay,
Yes.
one quick comparison I will give you is this. Okay, Congress party in India was started in 1880s, and it took them nearly 70 years to build that democratic system up at the ground level, which included Gandhi and Nehru, for example. Pakistan never had that system. Their movement started in 1920s. They ended up with the country in 1947, and that is reflecting now. Without the democratic evolutionary system, the democracies make very little sense in the political realities of the present. And that's exactly where the armies, such as the Pakistani army, provide a very strong, stable administrative structure so that the corrupt political parties do not really carry the show and spoil it in their own game. And that's exactly where businesses need to understand they shouldn't be ruffled by the belligerent statements or grandstanding statements in the West saying that Pakistan is a military dictatorship. That makes very little sense, because at the ground level, what businesses need is political stability where it enables them to do business, operate business. Okay, so political parties are only going to line their pockets, as opposed to army. Of course, there is corruption there as well, but they ensure a certain degree of stability. Paul, would you?
Yeah, look, Bhargav, it's interesting you say that. I think the same applies here in Thailand. Everyone talks about democracy like it's the never-ending bastion of goodness. I mean, the reality is politicians and political parties get manipulated, and they manipulate one man, one vote everywhere. The greatest problem in the outcomes of democratic votes is politicians seeking often privileged jobs that aren't that accountable, and in some countries very unaccountable and have all kinds of privileges and are even masked from laws that the rest of society face. And I'm thinking of Australia, not all the other countries that are popping to mind in your heads. That the person that doesn't understand politics or isn't astute in reading between the lines and the critical thinking necessary to evaluate who they're voting for, and with politicians being very shy to take risks and very happy to minimise risks to maximise their chance of getting yet another unaccountable or limited accountable tenure, is of grave concern. And the reality is one man, one vote works if one man and the next, and we should, I guess, be using the term person, but if they're all of equal understanding of the issues and the people and can see through, let's face it, what is often well-masked bollocks, and can evaluate policies which are often very short on and the rhetoric's very full on. So I think it's very similar here, that the military in Thailand offers a very stable environment. It stops the red shirt, yellow shirt demonstrations. If you like, it stops the inefficiency of a dog chasing its tail that isn't quite long enough to catch. But in the metaphor, in the case of many countries in Southeast Asia, the politicians aren't actually about what's good for the society moving forward. It's very much about getting themselves into a position from which they can leverage wealth for themselves, their tribe, and their political comrades. Bhargav, anything to add that pops to mind before we call it a day?
Paul, I would just outline saying that the businesses, especially in the West, need to understand precisely the points you highlighted, Paul. They need to understand the political reality and the space in which they do business. And all of this talk about democracy and political instability, they need to understand that military forces, especially those in Thailand, as well as Pakistan for that matter, are extremely mature. Okay, they understand what is required. They know their limits. They know that they've had backlash as well. So they are the stabilizing force across the board. So I would like to underline that and end it there.
Look, I'm going to add one other point there, Bhargav, and that is that a great challenge facing anybody is our own prejudices, and our own prejudices are built into us. We think only China has a propaganda program and only Russia has. We don't actually know that our own democratic systems establish those screening medias to act for and on behalf, and they survive in a synergistic fashion. Unfortunately, most Western companies we deal with don't think they have those prejudices. They don't think they're limited by their own selection of people. We deal with, obviously, a lot of different companies across a lot of different sectors. And I have to say, whilst those companies need to understand it, the chances of them understanding it are very different from the statement. And that is because they have to be like-minded and follow the values and the culture in their company, and they all assume that that's good and right. And they don't hire people that push back. I always raise this point because it continues to be valid despite people, but I'm directing this at not realizing it. But if you've only ever worked in a Western type country, even if you're representing a Western company and you're operating in a tier 1 city, Singapore, Hong Kong, you're not going to learn the things we're talking about, Bhargav, which is why our team has been established to have, geographical diversity, language diversity, understand different legal and political systems, and have the nous they have. Because, if we have this discussion with many companies, with their risk management internal people and their contracted advisors in Singapore and Hong Kong, you're going to get vague looks and scoff laughs because they think they are there providing risk solutions. They're not. They're keeping everybody in the management team warm and fuzzy that they're on the right direction and picking up a salary. And it's quite sad actually to see the expenditure on risk management teams, security teams, emergency management teams, response teams, preventative security teams, blah, 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 call them whatever you want. But there is a limited talent pool of which very little of that has had a high exposure to the many different political systems, governance systems, understand the complexities of the military. They can all read about it, they can understand the words, they can have an eloquent discussion about it, but really they can't add much value, or they certainly can't change the very large ships that are often controlled by prejudiced values, and that ship's heading in a certain direction, and suddenly, boom, there's a war, or there's a gas crisis, or there's a fuel crisis, and who'd have thunk? Well, the people that would have thunk are the people that can think, because they can actually give everything context based on the agility and the complexities around them, rather than be guided by the cultures that they happen to be existing with and benefiting from. Anyway, look, we have another couple of meetings coming up, so let's call it a day on that one. Cheers.
Certainly, Paul. Thank you.